This video is a response to the video that Adam Neely posted last night entitled Music Theory is Racist. If you haven't seen that video yet, I encourage you to watch it first. This video is very much a reaction to it. I apologize in advance if this is a little bit of a ramble. I haven't totally planned out what I'm going to say yet. So I watched the video last night, and after watching it, my initial reaction was, wow, this video is going to inspire a lot of criticism from people who have probably never seen it, or from people whose preconceived notions were so strong that there was really no way that they could watch a video with that title and not want to respond angrily. So the first thing I want to do is I want to address some things that people are probably going to be saying about it, if they're not already saying about it. The title of the video is Music Theory is Racist. But they're not saying studying and exploring music on a theoretical level itself is racist. And they're certainly not saying that exploring harmony and melody and rhythm and musical elements in an academic setting itself is racist. What the title means, and the argument that they make pretty clearly in the video, is that music theory, capital M, capital T, as we teach it in our universities and our conservatories, and as it is codified in many of the music theory textbooks that are out there and the AP exam, is rooted in a worldview that is explicitly white supremacist, that is drenched in white Germanic supremacism. And throughout the video, they show reasons why this is true, and they give some suggestions or some ideas of how we can take our current music theory programs and open them up so that they are more universal and so that they are less beholden to this 300-year-old explicitly white supremacist worldview. So they're not saying that music theory as a practice in its purest form is racist. I mean, Adam Neely's channel is a music theory channel, and his guest, Phil Ewell, is a music theory professor. And they're not saying that musical concepts being understood in a theoretical framework are racist, right? There are probably going to be people who assume that that's what they're saying, or who try to make it out to be what they're saying, and it's not what they're saying. It should also be said that none of what they're saying is breaking any ground, really. This video lays out these concepts very clearly, in a very orderly way. It makes the case very strongly, but nothing that they're saying is groundbreaking. In fact, what they're saying, I think, is very much echoed in many people in the wider music theory, musicology, and academic music communities, myself included. And these ideas are things that we've been sharing and talking about for a long time, right? So, if anyone's out there saying something along the lines of, well, now they're saying that music theory needs to be canceled. It's like, well, no, this video is making a specific case, but it's not a new idea, right? It's not like all of a sudden people want to add music theory to the list of things that are supposedly being canceled, right? And if you disagree, well, here's the deal, right? Even if you strip away all of the talk of racism from this conversation, and even if you scrub any mention of white supremacy from the video is still making probably the most valid point you can make about contemporary music theory instruction. That here, in 2020, our music theory curricula are still rooted fundamentally in the musical conception and the musical practice of 18th century Germanic composers. And the framework that we use to study music theory was developed by Germanic people who believed that this particular conception of music and this particular worldview and this particular set of practices were the highest evolution of human music. and that anything that does not grow from this tradition is secondary or less than or the other, right? Even if you ignore the fact that this conception was developed by white European men, it's still undeniable that this 300-year-old way of looking at music and analyzing music and these 300-year-old musical practices are still elevated in our academic settings as the ideal and as the universal way of looking at and studying music. I went to Syracuse University and I had the opportunity to perform in the traditional Chinese music ensemble. And this was a really great experience for me that definitely opened my mind to a lot of different ways to approach music that I hadn't had my mind open to before. And while I was there, I was also in the University Jazz Ensemble and the Jazz Combo. All of these things were great experiences, but these were all electives, right? The mainline music theory coursework at Syracuse, just like it was anywhere else and still is probably at 90% of our musical academic institutions. The mainline ideology and conception that informed the primary coursework was still rooted in this 300-year-old Germanic tradition. And we see this even at institutions that have departments devoted to music other than what you could call Western art music or Western classical music. For example, take the jazz programs that we have. Even at larger institutions that have their own jazz curriculum and their own jazz faculty and their own jazz degree programs, the jazz program is considered separate from the mainline music studies, right? It's a separate study that from within that mainline study is considered optional or whatever, right? That's still happening today. I inherited my grandfather's books after he passed away, and he has a number of music theory textbooks that span from the 1930s through the 1960s. And when I read this, like this is Harmony and Melody, Volume 1, The Diatonic Style by Ellie Siegelmeister. So this is a book that, on its cover is about harmony and melody, which are two very universal concepts that span cultures and history and time, right? Harmony and melody. A good composition forms an artistic whole. A Bach fugue, a Beethoven symphony, a Bartók quartet is more than the sum of its parts. So right in the preface, they're going directly for the music of these 18th century Germanic composers, and they're throwing Bartók in, who is not Germanic, he's Hungarian, just for good measure. But then they talk about Wagner, then they talk about Bach. Then they start talking about Schenker and another Viennese, Ernst Tock. So William Schumann, Paul Hindemith. I mean, what are these names all representing? What are these people all representing? This is a book that's presenting harmony and melody, which are universal concepts, and is entirely limited in its scope to the music of Germanic composers and the composers from Germanic adjacent nations who are following in the tradition or grounded in that tradition. Now, this book is from 1965, and the more contemporary music theory textbooks definitely include music that does not come from this tradition, right? The music theory book that I used in college was called Music in Theory and Practice. And they were very keen to include the occasional example from jazz music or the occasional example from pop and folk music. But the presentation of the material and the lens through which we were looking at the material was completely rooted in this tradition, right? And I recently looked at the current edition of that book, and the current edition of that book seems very similar to the version that I used in the year 2000 when I was doing my undergraduate studies. So even if you scrub all the talk of racism and all the talk of white supremacy from this conversation, our music theory textbooks and our music theory programs and our AP music theory exam still treat the musical conception of a select number of 18th century Germanic composers and thinkers as if it is the absolute way to look at music, and as if it is the purest window through which to analyze and talk about music and to study it at deeper and wider levels. And so even if you scrub race and you scrub white supremacy from the conversation, I think there's a lot of truth right there. But you can't scrub race and white supremacy when you're talking about people like Schenker and when you're talking about the glorification of the Germanic ideal. You just cannot, right? When you are hoisting specific Germanic white men and their musical conception and their musical output and their musical process and their musical devices as the highest, as the apex of human achievement, as the universal lens through which we should see the entire idea of music, you are engaging in centuries of white supremacy, right? Schenker was around during the height of European colonialism, right? He was around during the height of this arrogant, chauvinistic mindset that said European society is the highest, European society is the most advanced, and everywhere else in the world will be better when European society is applied to it, right? And you can't deny it. You know, whether you decide that that's a problem or not is on you. That's for you to decide. But the case that they are making is undeniable, and it's pretty much irrefutable, that the music theory tradition that forms the basis of our capital M and capital T music theory programs in this nation and throughout most of the Western world, I'm sure, is rooted in a worldview that explicitly elevates the conception of a certain group of white men to the status of universality and to a status of perfection, basically, and attempts to use this lens and this conception to describe other music that's not necessarily going to fit in that lens, right? And this practice is just soaking with racism and with white supremacy, right? White supremacy, the supremacy of these people and of this European mindset. Again, I don't think you can argue against this being the case. Whether or not you think this is a problem or something that needs to be fixed or solved is, I guess that's on you, right? If you have no problem with this, that's its own thing, right? But I don't think it's going to be possible to make a case that what Adam Neely and Phil Ewell and the other people in that video were saying is anything but completely true. So I have some other thoughts about it that I'd be happy to share if this video gets any traction. I will be happy to share a couple more ideas that are more related to what they were talking about in terms of what a music theory program could look like. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but that's its own conversation. So anyway, if you've seen the video and you needed that little extra bit of analysis, I hope this provided it for you. But in general, I just wanted to make sure that this was made very, very clear. So thank you for watching, and thanks.